You can't write a headline like this.
A shocking theft.
There it goes.
I never saw something so brazen.
This is one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen.
Leads to a hunt for an unusual kind of kidnapper.
I was like, that's my shark, and I'm bringing her home.
Business with exotic animals is thriving.
And coming up later, a jaw-dropping getaway.
A unique way to escape prison.
One of the most audacious escapes in contemporary history.
Sets off a massive manhunt.
I thought the guy was dead.
This story is, to its core, pretty ridiculous.
July 28, 2018 starts out like any other hot summer day in South Texas. People flock to the San Antonio Aquarium to beat the heat. It's home to over 8,000 living aquatic species. Everything seems normal until security cameras capture a truly brazen and bizarre crime.
You can't write a headline like this.
Everyone's out there having a great time looking at the exhibits, and then we see something strange occur.
Two men and a woman with a stroller enter the facility, and the cameras are rolling.
So we have a woman with a baby, we have a guy who's leaning into a fish tank, and now we have a third guy who's with them kind of in the background. So nothing seems to be really off initially, but it turns out they had something else in mind other than looking at the fish.
Shortly after 2 p.m., the man standing by the tank makes a shocking move.
So now we see this guy, and his shirt's wet, and it looks like he's kind of coddling something. And then we have this other guy who's following behind him.
The two men return, and now one of them has something wrapped in a wet, dripping blanket.
What's in that blanket that this guy has?
Whatever it is, the men gingerly place it into the stroller, disguising it as a baby. And then the threesome suddenly hightail it towards the nearest exit. And that's not all. To distract attention from what they're doing, they also cleverly create a disruptive diversion with bleach.
They took our bleach bucket and dumped it into the other exhibit into the system. So we had to react very, very fast.
Now, the animals in the aquarium are in imminent danger.
I was giving instructions to my marine staff as to what to do with the exhibit that just had chemicals poured into it.
Some of the staff race to the parking lot, while others quickly scramble to pull the aquarium's surveillance footage to see if they can figure out what was taken from the tank.
There it goes.
And instantly we knew it was a horn shark because we go in there and we're like, that's Helen. Like, he took Helen.
The staff is shocked when they realize it's their beloved Miss Helen. She's a juvenile female horn shark, a species native to Western North America.
What made Miss Helen so special was she was our only horn shark.
They are furious and stunned at the audacity of these brazen thieves.
They just waited for an opportune time and they scooped up Helen and put her in the stroller.
With the aquarium in chaos and the suspects on the move, an urgent call goes out to the Leon Valley Police Department.
The employees called us and said that they had had a shark that was stolen. The funny part was it was Shark Week, and I thought they were messing with me.
Police are wondering, is this real? Did someone actually kidnap a shark?
I mean, first of all, when you call, hey, somebody stole my shark, stole what? stole our shark. It was such an odd case for them.
Many people don't realize that there's a large black market for exotic animals being trafficked within the United States. And business lately with exotic animals is thriving.
As police race to the aquarium, the trio of suspects make it outside to the parking lot, where more cameras are waiting, and so are aquarium staff.
They were confronted by an employee that saw them get dripping. She confronted him, tried to talk to him.
I asked him if he would allow me to search his car, that we had suspicions that something was stolen and that we needed to search it. And he said no. He said he needed to take his baby to the doctor immediately and that he had spilled a cup of water in his stroller, which is why it was leaking.
Jenny is certain the man is lying, but they can't prove what's hidden in the stroller is actually a shark. And what if it really is a child?
We can't take a stroller and a child. We were in a very compromised situation.
He's a big guy. I didn't want to physically challenge that or anything, so we did write down his license plate and let them go.
So the thieves race out of the parking lot, but the aquarium employees are already on the move.
I immediately called the Leon Valley Police Department and reported their license plate number.
Leon Valley Police are able to trace the license plate to an address 20 miles northeast of the aquarium. It looks like an ordinary suburban house on an ordinary suburban cul-de-sac. But what's inside is nothing short of extraordinary.
I've been involved in law enforcement for over 25 years, and this is one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen.
A trio of thieves took Shark Week too far.
On July 28, 2018, the San Antonio Aquarium becomes the scene of a truly bizarre crime.
They walk right into a busy Texas aquarium and then right out with a live shark.
Why would anyone want to kidnap a shark?
And it's all been caught on camera in broad daylight.
When I actually saw the video, I was just completely in shock. He reached in with his hands and pulled it out.
In the surveillance, you can literally see them scoop up the animal. And you would think, okay, normally catching a shark is not that easy. However, we're an interactive facility. So as guests do come through the door, they are able to touch animals with 2 fingers on the back. We train them for desensitization, so they're very much used to being handled.
The daring crime shocks everyone.
I mean, I've been a policeman a long time. I never saw something so brazen and really so stupid for somebody to do something like that. You'd think they were some young kids or something like that, but no, they were middle-aged Americans.
Police traced the license plate to the home of Anthony Shannon.
He wasn't the one who actually physically stolen the shark, but he was the driver of the vehicle, and he'd been arrested multiple times. He was an animal enthusiast.
And when they open his garage, they are stunned at what they find inside.
We went into his garage to recover the shark, and it was beautiful inside. It was almost like the aquarium itself.
He actually had a whole setup for aquatics. And he had various other fish species in there. He was in a saltwater system with other saltwater fish. He had knowledge about saltwater. He had knowledge about life support systems.
I can't remember how many hundreds of gallons his main tank was, but it was huge.
Anthony Shannon and his 2 companions are arrested and charged with theft. And less than 72 hours after the heist, police summoned Jamie to the garage to make sure the shark they found is indeed the aquarium's precious Miss Helen.
That right there? Yes. Okay, you're positive?
Positive. And when I catch her, I'll show you that she's female.
Okay, very well.
Males will have claspers hanging up from the bottom. She clearly does not have any sort of claspers.
Okay, you're 100%. You're identifying that shark?
Yes, sir.
Excellent.
I loved that shark, and I could definitely ID her and certain characteristics that she had and things like that. I was like, that's my shark, and I'm bringing her home.
And as it turns out, Miss Helen isn't the only seemingly cold-blooded creature Jamie is able to identify. She realizes she knows one of the suspects.
This gentleman, I could recognize him straight off the bat because he had previously reached out to me to test my water, trying to impersonate a salt company called Instant Ocean. And he did come here at one point in time to meet me in person. And from the get-go, it just seemed something was very odd and just out of place. And so that's why I could easily identify him.
It seems Anthony Shannon had been casing out the aquarium for weeks in his attempt to pull off the perfect shark heist.
Well, they did a lot of planning. What they didn't take into account and what they should have taken into account was the fact that there was video cameras and there was people there. And at the end of the day, crime doesn't pay, and you're eventually going to get caught no matter how well you think you've done in planning. Your day's going to come.
Today, Miss Helen swims free once again in the aquarium. And now, she's a local hero.
She became very, very popular, and we didn't want anybody trying to take her again. So we now have more horn sharks. She is in a camouflage of other horn sharks.
And it's a reminder to everyone just how valuable exotic animals have become.
This is one of the strangest stories that I've heard in my many years in law enforcement. The illegal trading of exotic animals happens more than one might think. you might not know what your neighbor has in their house.
And coming up, a daring escape sets off another intense manhunt.
You hear the stories that happen when people get out of prison. This is very, very dangerous.
It's a brazen scene that looks like something out of a movie.
Geez, this is really happening. It was kind of crazy.
It happens on Saturday, October 6th, 2018, just after 9 p.m. at the Metro County Jail in Louisville, Kentucky. At first, it looks like routine evening activity outside the jail's kitchen.
An inmate worker wheeling trash cans from the kitchen out to the loading dock.
But then, a startling surprise.
The 2 garbage cans open and out pop 2 prisoners.
You see the lids kind of pop up and you see the 2 men are literally in the trash cans.
The 2 inmates dart behind a dumpster and rip off their orange jumpsuits. Then, one of them runs back to grab something from the trash can. With no signs of anyone around, it looks like they're about to make a run for it.
The area beside Metro Corrections was literally a door that went out to a platform where you put the garbage cans, and then there was a ramp where you can walk down. There's no fence, there's no gate. It's very open space, and if you can run fast, unless there's somebody there to catch you, they're probably not going to catch you.
And these bold inmates don't even bother to run. They casually stroll away as if they're doing nothing wrong. And then, they're gone. Just like that, these 2 prisoners have pulled off a bold getaway.
It's probably one of the most audacious escapes in contemporary history.
You immediately begin to think about El Chapo and his escape from prison in Mexico, where he was wheeled out in a laundry cart.
The minimum security jail, which houses about 2,000 inmates, has more than 300 cameras. And Mark Bolton, who at the time was the director of the Louisville Metro Department of Corrections, is furious.
We have a lot of cameras. It was a kind of a sick-to-your-stomach anger, just a lack of fundamental corrections 101.
Where were the people who should have been watching these 2 prisoners?
Obviously failed to look in those trash cans, allowing those trash cans to go out to the loading dock without even being opened or looked at.
How silly that it should be that easy to just break out of prison on a little garbage can. Something in our system has really broken down for it to be that easy to break out of prison.
There's always that movie where you see the prisoners escaping through a sewer and all that kind of thing. These characters actually did it, but they did it in plastic garbage cans.
And now, 2 potentially dangerous inmates are on the loose in Louisville. And for Bolton, the pressure is on to figure out who they are.
I immediately began to think, what were these guys in custody for? What's their criminal history? What is the risk to the community now that they've escaped?
Time is absolutely of the essence. We don't know where they're going. Who are they going to meet up with? It is urgent that they be located and recaptured.
A massive manhunt is launched to find them, and their getaway is all over the news.
A daring escape out of garbage cans.
Authorities say the escapees were rolled out in garbage cans.
It was a big event. It was played on national TV.
A Kentucky jailbreak that was caught on camera.
It was also embarrassment. In my 40-year career, we've never had an incident like that.
But Mark doesn't have time to be angry.
You got 2 inmates that are on the loose, obviously, that don't want to be apprehended.
And authorities are about to find out just how far these escapees will go to avoid going back to jail.
We hear the loud boom and a crash. I thought the guy was dead.
Authorities in Kentucky are searching for 2 inmates.
In October 2018, 2 prisoners make a bold escape from the Louisville Metro Corrections facility.
A unique way to escape prison.
The 2 men who pull off their getaway by hiding in garbage cans that are wheeled out of the jail's kitchen are quickly identified as 27-year-old Justin Stumler and 38-year-old Jeremy Hunt. Both are minimum security inmates who work in the kitchen. Hunt was arrested 4 months earlier on burglary charges. Stumler had been in for 2 months on charges that included theft and drug possession. But with both of them now on the run, the stakes are high.
One of them had a firearms history. You betcha we're really concerned about what they might do. I mean, they don't want to get caught. So yeah, it's high drama, and you're having a sleepless night that night.
So you're at home, safe and sound, you think, but unbeknownst to you, there's two dangerous criminals out there just running around free. It kind of opens up Pandora's box of your greatest nightmares. And so you can't really breathe again until they catch them and get them locked back up again.
At the jail, there's another concern. How did they pull this off? Did the escapees have help from the inside?
We think that it was coordinated at least amongst the inmates. It's staff complacency, and staff complacency can get somebody killed.
Bolton and his staff at the jail immediately set up a high-tech command center to investigate the escape and locate the runaway prisoners.
With software that allows us to listen to inmate phone calls, to use Google Mapping, we were able to determine they had access to cell phones. And once we began to access those cell phone numbers, we were able to ping those cell phone towers, and we just began to track them. We were able to track them almost in real time.
But by the next day, Sunday, October 7th, authorities still haven't been able to locate the escapees.
They know we've got a beat on them. It's on the news.
Their escape was caught on camera.
Authorities still were searching for the men.
So I think that they were probably scared, changing their appearance, changing vehicles, and they would get into one vehicle and meet an acquaintance somewhere else and then get into that vehicle. And so we were one step behind them almost the entire time.
With police on high alert, the entire city of Louisville is on edge as the prisoners elude capture.
Now they're running through the community. There is no more control. And who might they hurt and what might they damage on their way to freedom?
By the morning of Monday, October 8th, the inmates have been on the loose for 36 hours. There have been glimpses of them near a high school Saturday night and again on Sunday morning walking towards another county. But every time a tip comes in, they're gone by the time police arrive. Then, finally, there's a promising lead. An anonymous tip that Justin Stumler plans to meet a family member at a fast food restaurant. They quickly swarm in, and when they spot Stumler, they corner him and arrest him. Now, only Jeremy Hunt remains at large. But a few hours later, after he attempts to use stolen credit cards at a gas station, police get eyes on him too, driving a stolen white truck.
He was driving back towards the Louisville area, and he was spotted and got into a high-speed chase with Meade County law enforcement personnel.
And that's when things get really scary. Hunt seems to be in a panic, driving erratically through local neighborhoods. As innocent people suddenly find themselves in danger, there are comments on the police department's Facebook page like, "The guy nearly killed me, missed me by an inch."
Somebody out on his lunch break is almost struck by the prisoner fleeing in a stolen car.
We heard the car chase on the scanner. The assignment editor said, hey, we have several cars that have been hit along the highway.
It's intense. Numerous agencies join the chase before it finally comes to a dramatic end. At 3:45 p.m. at a busy intersection, there is a terrifying 5-car collision.
The driver literally plowed through a couple intersections. There was glass everywhere. It looked pretty bad.
The vehicle driven, according to witnesses, by that escaped inmate.
Rudy Sweeney is working nearby.
We hear the loud boom. I thought the guy was, dead. I didn't know what to think. And so I was just yelling, help, help.
Nobody is dead, but at least 3 innocent bystanders are injured and rushed to the hospital. The man who caused all the chaos, escaped prisoner Jeremy Hunt, tries to make a run for it on foot, but he doesn't get very far. And now, both Hunt and Stumler are back behind bars.
In the end, we were able to get these guys back in custody very, very quickly.
Did you really think you weren't actually gonna get caught, guys? Come on.
Both prisoners end up with far longer sentences than they would have had they not tried to pull off the audacious garbage can escape.
They received about another 5-year sentence, in addition to the charges they were already in custody for at the time.
So on the one hand, you're really clever, right? But on the other hand, you're really, really stupid. Because what you've done is complicated things and gotten yourself more time. Not so ingenious.
3 other inmates who helped orchestrate the escape are also disciplined. And with the looming question of how it happened in the first place, there were penalties for the people who should have kept a closer eye on the runaways.
The 2 officers that were on duty in that duty post received very, very severe discipline and extended suspension time.
Bolton has retired now, but says this is an escape he will never forget.
Very brazen escape. And I'm still angry about that, and I always will be.
A boyfriend wakes up to find his girlfriend gone.
It was the most scared I've been in my life.
You see the man sneak up on the woman.
He kidnapped her? She sends a series of terrified texts.
We've got to find her quick before something bad happens.
But this victim has a plan.
That's when I knew I was in trouble.
And coming up later, another young woman is snatched off the street.
Gone in 30 seconds.
Please give her back.
We were preparing for the worst.
But she too finds a clever way to fight back.
I was thinking, is this how I'm gonna die?
This is an amazing story of survival.
The kidnapping unfolds as another shopper walks by.
The video is haunting. Monday, September 4th, 2017, just after 11:30 p.m., Carrollton, Georgia. A young woman walks into a grocery store. 11 minutes later, she heads back to her car.
As she exited the store, the unthinkable happened.
She has no idea that she's being followed by a stranger who sneaks up on her, forces her into the passenger's seat, then disappears out of the parking lot. Where is he taking her? At 11:57 p.m., a witness dials 911.
911, how can I help you?
I saw some weird situation. He grabbed her by the actual shoulder, and he had something in his right arm. It did not make sense.
So you think he kidnapped her?
A patrol car is dispatched to check things out, but finds nothing suspicious. Then, at 2 a.m., Tamir Bryant is woken up by a disturbing text from his girlfriend, 21-year-old Jayla Gladden, a student at the University of West Georgia.
It was the most scared I've been in my life.
Jayla, who Tamir has on his phone under her affectionate name Fat Face, has sent a location pin. It says she's in Atlanta, but that's 50 miles away. And the last thing he knew, she was only 10 minutes away.
She told me she wasn't feeling too well. She wanted to go get medicine from the store. We should be right back. I just fell asleep. So then I was immediately worried. Why did you send that? Where you at?
Jayla's response is chilling. She writes just one word: kidnapped. Tamir responds, stop playing. And then Jayla writes something that makes his blood run cold. On God.
Which is a slang term that we use. It just means, I'm being completely serious.
Within minutes, Tamir storms into the Carrollton police station, accompanied by a group of their worried friends.
I banged on all of her roommates' doors. Just yelled, Jayla's been kidnapped.
While they are en route, more terrifying texts come from Jayla. Knife. Scared. And as Tamir shows them to police, his emotions veer from anger to panic. Then, things get even worse. Jayla writes, I don't want him to kill me. Now, police know the clock is ticking.
I said, I've got to find her quick before something bad happens.
By 2:30 a.m. on September 5th, authorities in both Carrollton and Atlanta, along with the Secret Service, are all frantically searching for Jayla.
We were just moving as fast as we could to try to save her life.
They know that Jayla is in her own car, a green Honda Accord, and that she's using her phone to secretly give information to her boyfriend, Tamir.
She was very brave. She was very smart because information she was giving her boyfriend was immediate.
But as authorities try to trace Jayla's phone in order to pinpoint her exact location, things become increasingly alarming.
Oh, wait a second. She is.
Jayla writes, "Might put me in trunk." And at 2:42 a.m., she types, "Don't let me die," and then goes eerily silent. After going to the police to tell them that his girlfriend Jayla Gladden has been kidnapped, Tamir Bryant starts to fall apart.
So that was because I couldn't do anything.
A series of frightening texts come in from Jayla, but suddenly she goes silent. Then, just before 4 a.m., police get a break. They locate Jayla and her kidnapper in a parking lot at an apartment complex in Atlanta. But as they rush in to save her, Jayla's kidnapper spots them and hits the gas.
I heard someone yelling, and then I heard some kind of screeching.
Within seconds, all hell breaks loose. As police chase him, the kidnapper slams into one car after another.
This car was like speeding. He kept hitting cars and going. He hit a police car and kept going. It was like a scene from a movie.
Then, as the kidnapper frantically tries to get out of the parking lot, there's another loud crash. As police run around the corner, the kidnapper jumps out of the car. And then, so does Jayla. She runs towards them, pointing at the fence, then collapses into one of the officer's arms.
I gave the officer that was there a hug. I just didn't see myself being rescued.
Jayla's kidnapper is gone. He has scaled the fence. Police identify him as 28-year-old Timothy Wilson, a felon who's recently been released from prison after serving time for theft. As they hunt for him, Jayla is rushed to a hospital. 3 years later, her terrifying ordeal is still difficult to talk about. It all begins when a strange man approaches the college student asking for a lighter.
I told him I didn't have one, so I continued to walk to my car, and I felt something in like my abdomen area.
With a knife to her stomach, Jayla gets her first chilling look at her kidnapper.
I had a moment of just like a stare into his eyes. And then that's when I knew I was in trouble. You could tell he just didn't care.
And that is only the beginning of what will be 4 absolutely horrifying hours. After hiding Jayla's phone under his seat, Wilson announces that he's taking her to Atlanta. As he drives, he keeps the knife frighteningly close, just inches away from Jayla.
I was holding my breath. I was extremely angry. I was just going to get tea. Why is this happening to me? I'm sick. I left the parking lot not even knowing if I was going to go back to my boyfriend or school.
The most horrific part of Jayla's ordeal comes when Timothy Wilson pulls into an empty church parking lot, violently assaults her, then sits her on a playground bench.
It was like a 2-tier bench, so I was on the bottom and then he was on the top with his arm around my neck. So that's when he proceeded to tell me that it would be easier to kill me, you know, because there was nobody around. Yeah.
But somehow, Jayla still bravely manages to strategize. When Wilson tells her that he needs to go to Michigan, she convinces him to give her phone back so she can help him with directions.
The first thing I did was turn my brightness down on my phone, and then I shared my location to my boyfriend.
The next few hours are unbearable. Wilson stops at several locations to case stores that he wants to rob, and each time forces Jayla into the trunk and takes her phone away again. Jayla begins to lose hope. Silently, she prays that the messages she has sent to her boyfriend will work.
Where we were parked, he had me sitting in his lap, and I braced myself for having the knife touch me again.
But then they see flashlights, and Wilson desperately tries to get away.
He has the knife in his hand, ends up like cutting his hand, and then he jumps out and runs and jumps the fence.
Finally, Jayla is free. As she runs towards the police, sobbing in relief, the very first thing she does is call Tamir.
She literally finds the strength to FaceTime my phone. When I answered the phone, she's running.
Wilson is arrested on a park bench in Atlanta less than 12 hours after Jayla is rescued and sentenced 9 months later.
The man who kidnapped and sexually assaulted a college student in Carrollton will now spend the rest of his life in prison.
For Jayla, it's a night she will never be able to forget. But she also knows how brave she was and is grateful that her quick thinking very likely saved another victim.
If it wasn't me that night, it would have been somebody else who he might have killed.
Surprisingly, Jayla isn't the only brave young kidnap victim who feels that way. Coming up, another shocking story of extraordinary survival.
Gone in 30 seconds.
November 2nd, 2014. Just before 9:40 p.m., Germantown, Philadelphia. It's your usual quiet Sunday night.
This is Green Street. This is Coulter Street here.
A surveillance camera captures two shadowy figures as they cross the street.
You see him shaking the girl's hand. Doesn't seem like anything at first.
But this is more than a handshake. This is a kidnapping.
She was screaming at the top of her lungs, saying, "Help, help."
You see someone being dragged against their will.
The young woman fights for her life. At one point, she tumbles to the sidewalk before she's forced into a car.
This whole situation literally took place in 30 seconds.
Then, another shock.
It was like a lot of commotion inside of the car, and the windows just exploded.
Dwayne Fletcher is walking home from the store when he first notices the woman ahead of him.
It's so dark, and she just kept looking back. So I was like, oh, okay, well, let me get on the other side of the street so she can feel a little bit safe.
The woman walks out of view, but minutes later, Dwayne hears screams. And then, that terrifying explosion.
And I think she probably got shot.
He immediately dials 911.
And I was like, I believe somebody's getting kidnapped.
Every second turns into a race against the clock. Where was he going to take her? What was he going to do with her?
As the kidnapper speeds away, Dwayne notices some things on the sidewalk.
Her cell phone was laying in the streets. Her glasses was laying in the street.
Perhaps the woman left them behind as clues. Police can't find any bullets or casings, so they don't think she was shot. They think she broke the glass on purpose.
She left the phone there as a way for you to track her down.
She's an intelligent girl. Yes.
The woman is identified as 22-year-old nurse's aide Carlisha Freeland Gaither. She is the oldest of 7 close siblings and was just on her way home from a family gathering.
You're walking down the street, minding your business, and somebody can come and just grab you. This is emotional for me. Sorry.
How is it possible that in just 30 seconds, she's gone? At this point, only one thing seems clear. Carlisha is fighting for her life.
This girl was very brave and attempted to do whatever she could to fight back.
But where has she been taken? By Monday, November 3rd, a massive manhunt is underway to find her, and video of her chilling abduction makes worldwide news.
The woman was dragged down the street in Philadelphia.
Carlisha Freeland Gaither, son ravisseur présumé, est recherché par l'État.
Police and Carlisha's family plead for help.
Give her back, please, give her back.
It's every parent's worst nightmare.
As a parent, your biggest fear is for someone to hurt your child. You always want to protect them. And the moment that you can't,
then, 24 hours into the search, police get their first break. A man is caught on camera using Carlicia's ATM card. The bank video is recorded at 6:01 a.m. Monday, November 3rd in Aberdeen, Maryland, 80 miles south of Philadelphia. Just minutes later, at 6:03 a.m., the man is caught on camera again.
The person believed to be the suspect walking through a gas station convenience store in Maryland.
Then, on Tuesday, November 4th, 48 hours into the kidnapping, a woman who lives 5 miles from the gas station reports finding some strange things in her driveway. A cut zip tie, food wrappers, broken glass, and a receipt. Police track the receipt to a supermarket and more video. And this time, the face of Carlicia's abductor is clearly visible.
I see her in there. That was my biggest fear.
It was very difficult, and we were preparing for the worst. She was dead. She was gone.
22-year-old nurse's aide Carlicia Freeland Gaither has been kidnapped, and a massive manhunt is underway to find her abductor. Police identify him as 37-year-old Delvin Barnes, who has a long history of violent crime and is the suspect in another abduction in Virginia just 1 month earlier.
A 16-year-old Richmond girl who narrowly escaped with her life.
He raped her, then poured bleach and gasoline on her and began digging her grave.
What if Carlicia faces the same fate? It's a horrifying thought. But then, 3 days after Carlicia is kidnapped, police get a critical lead from the Virginia dealership where Delvin Barnes got his car.
The dealer, for some financial concerns, had placed a GPS device on the car. Minutes later, they locate the car in a parking lot.
The car is parked at a shopping mall in Jessup, Maryland, 120 miles from where Carlicia is kidnapped. FBI and ATF agents swarm in and find Carlicia and her kidnapper inside.
I remember a whole bunch of yelling, and I was still kind of confused. How did y'all find me?
Carlicia Freeland has been rescued. Her abductor has been arrested.
Barnes is held on federal charges of kidnapping and assault and attempted murder of the 16-year-old from Virginia.
Hopefully, he'll be in jail for the rest of his life.
Carlicia is checked at a local hospital, then reunited with family.
When they allowed me to walk into the room and Carlicia saw me, it was too emotional for me.
I never been so happy in my life.
The unimaginable 72-hour ordeal leaves Carlicia traumatized.
I was thinking, is this how I'm going to die?
Her abduction is completely random. When Barnes first approaches her, he asks for directions. But when he shakes her hand, she knows something is wrong.
As I try to pull away, he gripped tighter, and he wouldn't let go of my hand.
Somehow, in the horrifying 30 seconds that follow, as she is dragged down the street, Carlicia comes up with a plan.
I threw my cell phone on the ground, my glasses. Hopefully somebody will see it and know that I was there, that I was trying to get home.
Then, when Barnes forces her into his car, she tries to escape.
Under his seat, I see a hammer. I hit him with the hammer. There was blood everywhere. I thought, because it's so quiet, that he passed out because he was holding his head. So I hit the window and tried to get out. The window shattered. And I thought I was safe. I was free. He turns around and pulled me back in. I wanted to know if he was going to kill me or if he was going to rape me, or both.
As they drive out of Philadelphia, Carlicia's world passes by.
I can see my home. I can see my job. It's like my life was passing me before my eyes.
Barnes knows the police will be looking for him, but he's prepared. He has a pile of license plates he keeps swapping out.
I can hear him switching them, like when we stop.
She hears all of this from inside the trunk of his car. Barnes uses a zip tie to handcuff her, and when he's not assaulting her, makes her hide in the trunk.
The seat, he can put me in a trunk not by taking me out the car, but in the car. So he'll put the seat down and I'll crawl in the trunk. And then he'll put the seat up. So sorry.
In 2016, Barnes is sentenced to 35 years. It's difficult for Carlicia's family to see him in court.
The evil things that he's done to people was hard.
Carlicia is now a mom. Barnes is a parent too, and she wishes she could say something to his daughter.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry she had to see that.
And remarkably, this brave young woman says she's glad Barnes picked her.
I'm happy he chose me, because when I think about somebody else, I wouldn't want to put them through that.
On the morning of November 29th, 2014, the town of Santa Croce Camarina in Sicily awoke to what appeared to be another ordinary Saturday. The streets were quiet. Small businesses were beginning to open their doors. Families were following familiar routines. And children prepared for another school day. There was nothing about that morning to suggest it would become one of the darkest days in modern Italian criminal history. In a community where people recognized one another by face and name, tragedy was something that happened somewhere else. Yet within a matter of hours, that comforting illusion would be shattered beyond repair. At the center of the story was an 8-year-old boy named Loris Andrea Stivel. Like countless children across Italy, he was supposed to spend the morning in school before returning home to his family. According to the account that would initially guide the investigation, his mother, Veronica Panarello, had driven him to school as she normally did. She later explained that she watched him get out of the car before continuing on with the rest of her morning. It was, on the surface, an entirely ordinary sequence of events. Parents dropped off their children every day. Children disappeared into classrooms. Life moved forward. There seemed to be no reason to question such a familiar routine. But shortly after midday, that ordinary story collapsed. Veronica arrived at the local Carabinieri station carrying every parent's worst nightmare. She reported that when she went to collect Loris after school, his teachers informed her that he had never attended class. He had never been marked present. No one had seen him enter the school building. Somewhere between home and the classroom, an 8-year-old child had seemingly vanished. Missing child investigations always begin with hope. Investigators know that time is critical. Every minute matters. Every witness matters. Every possible sighting is treated as a chance to bring a child safely home. As news spread through Santa Croce Camarina, concern rapidly turned into a coordinated search. Officers, volunteers, and local residents joined efforts to locate the missing boy. At that stage, there was little reason to imagine anything other than an abduction, an accident, or a child who had somehow wandered away. The family's account appeared straightforward. A mother claimed she had taken her son to school. Teachers insisted he never arrived. Somewhere in between, a mystery waited to be solved. Yet the search would last only a few hours before taking a devastating turn. At approximately 4 o'clock that afternoon, A local resident named Orazio Fidone made a discovery near the area known as Mulino Vecchio. There, in a ravine only a few kilometers from the family's home, lay the body of a young boy. Authorities quickly arrived at the scene, and the terrible confirmation soon followed. The child was Lori's Andrea Stivel. The hope that had driven the search disappeared almost instantly, replaced by grief and disbelief. A missing person investigation had become a homicide investigation in a single afternoon. The emotional impact on the community was immediate. An 8-year-old child had lost his life under violent circumstances, and almost nothing about the case made sense. If Lori's had never entered school, where had he spent the morning? Who had been with him? How had he ended up in a remote location several kilometers away? Most importantly, who could have committed such a crime against a child? At the beginning of the investigation, there was no obvious answer. The family itself appeared, at least outwardly, to resemble countless others across Italy. Lori's lived with his mother, Veronica Panarello, and his father, Davide Stivel, a truck driver whose work frequently kept him away from home. There was no publicly known history of child abuse that would immediately place suspicion within the household. Like investigators in many missing child cases, authorities initially focused outward, considering the possibility that someone outside the family might be responsible. Veronica herself appeared to fit the image of a desperate parent searching for answers. She had reported her son missing. She insisted she had left him safely at school. From the beginning, she maintained that she did not know what had happened to him. At first glance, there was little reason to doubt her. But criminal investigations are rarely guided by appearances alone. They are built on timelines, physical evidence, witness testimony, and facts that can either support or dismantle a person's account. As investigators began reconstructing Lori's final known movements, small inconsistencies slowly emerged. A routine school morning became increasingly difficult to reconcile with objective evidence. The simple narrative of a child disappearing between a family car and a classroom door began to fracture. Each verified fact raised another question, and each new question moved investigators further away from the original story. The tragedy of Lori Stivel would ultimately become one of Italy's most discussed criminal cases, not only because of the victim's young age, but because the investigation would challenge one of the strongest assumptions people naturally make at the beginning of a missing child case: that the person reporting the disappearance is searching for the same truth as everyone else. As the evidence accumulated, investigators would discover that the answers they sought were not waiting somewhere beyond the school gates or hidden among strangers. Instead, they would be forced to examine the events of that Saturday morning from an entirely different perspective. The road that Lori's was supposed to travel lasted only a few minutes. It should have ended at the entrance to his school. Instead, it ended with a child's body discovered near Mulino Vecchio, a grieving community demanding answers, and an investigation that would uncover contradictions where certainty had once seemed to exist. The central mystery was no longer simply how an 8-year-old boy had disappeared. It had become something far more disturbing. If Lori's never reached his classroom, what truly happened during the short journey that was supposed to take him there? Before the investigation became dominated by forensic reports, surveillance footage, courtroom testimony, and conflicting statements, there was simply a little boy whose life was expected to follow an ordinary path. His name was Lori's Andrea Stivel, and he was only 8 years old when his life came to an abrupt and violent end on November 29th, 2014. Every discussion surrounding this case inevitably returns to the legal proceedings, the evidence, and the questions that captivated Italy for years. Yet beneath every document and every judicial decision lies the simple reality that this story began not as a criminal investigation, but as the life of a child who should have returned home after school. That truth remains the emotional center of the case. Lori's lived in Santa Croce Camarina, a municipality in the province of Ragusa on the southern coast of Sicily. Compared to Italy's larger cities, Santa Croce Camarina was a relatively small community where daily life followed familiar rhythms and neighbors often recognized one another. In places like these, routines become deeply predictable. Children leave for school along the same streets every morning. Parents carry out familiar errands. And people become accustomed to believing that tomorrow will look much like yesterday. That expectation of normalcy would make the events of late November 2014 even more difficult for the community to comprehend. According to the available information, Lori's lived with both of his parents, Veronica Panarello and Davide Stivel. Outwardly, the family appeared ordinary. There was nothing publicly known before the crime that suggested the household would one day become the focus of one of Italy's most widely discussed homicide investigations. No publicly documented history of child abuse surrounded the family. There were no widely reported incidents that had previously drawn the attention of authorities in relation to violence against the children. For investigators responding to the disappearance report, there was initially little reason to immediately suspect that the danger might have originated within the home itself. Davide Stivel worked as a truck driver, a profession that frequently required him to spend significant periods away from home. Long-distance driving often means irregular schedules, long hours on the road, and extended absences from family life. While these work demands formed part of the family's routine, nothing in the available evidence suggests that his occupation itself had any direct connection to the events that unfolded on November 29th. Nevertheless, his frequent absence became part of the broader picture of the family's daily life. Much of the household's everyday routine, therefore, centered around Veronica Panarello, who was responsible for many of the ordinary activities involved in raising a young child, including taking Lori's to school. It was a routine so common that no one would have viewed it as remarkable. Parents drive children to school every day across Italy and around the world. Such journeys rarely become memorable because they are repeated countless times without incident. That familiarity would later become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. The final journey of Lori's life began in circumstances that appeared completely routine. On the morning of November 29th, Veronica would later tell investigators that she had driven her son towards school as usual. According to her original account, she stopped outside the school, allowed Lori's to get out of the vehicle, and then continued with the rest of her morning. At first hearing, the explanation sounded entirely plausible. There is nothing extraordinary about a mother dropping her child off before running errands. Indeed, it was precisely because the account sounded so ordinary that investigators initially had little reason to reject it. Like every criminal investigation, however, police were required to establish a precise timeline. Every movement, every location, and every statement would eventually need to be verified independently. But before evidence began to challenge Veronica's account, authorities treated the matter as they would any other missing child case. They worked under the assumption that Lori's had disappeared after being left near his school. At that early stage, investigators did not yet know that virtually every important aspect of that timeline would soon come under scrutiny. The school itself played an unexpectedly central role in establishing the facts. According to Veronica's original statement, Lori's had been dropped off before classes began. She later explained that she only became alarmed when she returned to collect him and was informed by teachers that he had never attended class. That single claim transformed an ordinary Saturday into a crisis. If true, it meant that somewhere between the family vehicle and the entrance to the school, an 8-year-old child had vanished without anyone noticing. Such a possibility naturally directed early investigative attention toward the route to school and the surrounding area. The assumption was straightforward. If Lori's had reached the vicinity of the school, then perhaps someone else had encountered him before he entered the building. This initial framework shaped the first hours of the investigation. The possibility of an abduction or some other encounter outside the family seemed, at first, entirely reasonable. Veronica herself was viewed primarily as the worried mother of a missing child. She reported her son's disappearance to the Carabinieri after being told that he had never entered school. She consistently maintained that she had done what any parent would do that morning by driving him there. At this point in the investigation, there was little to distinguish her from countless other parents who had desperately sought police assistance after a child disappeared. The community likewise responded with sympathy. An 8-year-old child was missing, and local residents understood that every passing minute reduced the likelihood of a safe outcome. As officers and volunteers searched for Lori's, few people imagined that the answers they sought might not lie outside the family. It is often difficult to separate hindsight from the reality investigators faced in real time. Today, knowing the final outcome of the case, it may seem inevitable that suspicion would eventually fall upon Veronica. But in the earliest hours of the investigation, the available facts painted a far less certain picture. Police knew only that a child had apparently disappeared after being dropped off near school, until objective evidence suggested otherwise. Veronica's account remained the primary framework through which investigators understood the morning's events. This distinction is important because it demonstrates how criminal investigations evolve. They do not begin with conclusions. They begin with information that must be tested, verified, and sometimes disproved. At the center of this process stood Lori's himself, a child whose daily routine had suddenly become the subject of national attention. His final known morning would be reconstructed minute by minute, not because investigators wished to scrutinize the ordinary details of a school day, but because those ordinary details held the key to understanding how such an unimaginable tragedy could occur. The case would soon move beyond the emotional urgency of a missing child search and into the methodical world of forensic science, surveillance analysis, and witness verification. The comforting simplicity of the family's original account would gradually give way to a far more troubling reality. But before surveillance cameras, phone records, and forensic findings reshaped the investigation, there was only one uncontested fact. An 8-year-old boy had left home on what should have been a routine trip to school, and by the end of that same day, he had lost his life. Everything that followed, the contradictions, the investigation, the arrest, and the courtroom proceedings, would begin with that heartbreaking absence. The child who was expected to spend an ordinary morning in a classroom never arrived there at all. Instead, the ordinary routine that had defined his family's life would become the foundation upon which investigators reconstructed every minute of his final day. November 29, 2014, began with what appeared to be a completely ordinary family routine. According to Veronica Panarello's initial account, she left home with her 8-year-old son, Lori's Andrea Stivel, and drove him toward his school in Santa Croce Camarina, Sicily. She later told investigators that she had dropped him off outside the school before continuing with the rest of her morning. There was nothing in her description that immediately stood out as unusual. It was a familiar routine repeated by countless parents every school day. At that point, no one believed that the final moments of Lori's life had already passed. If Veronica's version of events had been accurate, Lori should have spent the morning inside his classroom alongside his classmates before returning home later that day. Instead, the routine came to an abrupt and devastating halt. As the hours passed, what initially seemed like an ordinary school morning slowly transformed into a mystery. The crucial turning point came around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, when Veronica went to the local Carabinieri station to report that her son was missing. She explained that when she arrived at the school to collect him, teachers informed her that Lori's had never attended class. According to her statement, She had left him outside the school earlier that morning. Yet somehow he had never entered the building. The implication was deeply alarming. If an 8-year-old child had disappeared between a parked vehicle and the entrance to his school, investigators had to consider every possible explanation. Had he wandered away? Had someone approached him? Had he become the victim of an abduction? At that moment, no possibility could be dismissed. The disappearance of a child always demands immediate action, and authorities responded accordingly. Time is one of the most critical factors in any missing child investigation. Every passing hour can reduce the chances of locating a child safely, making rapid coordination essential. Following Veronica's report, officers began organizing a search effort while attempting to establish the boy's last confirmed movements. Because the only available timeline came from Veronica herself, investigators initially worked from the assumption that Lori's had been left near the school that morning. Their immediate task was to determine where he might have gone afterward. Local residents also became aware that something was terribly wrong. In a community like Santa Croce Camarina, news of a missing child spread quickly. The disappearance of an 8-year-old was not merely a police matter. It became a concern shared by an entire town. Every potential sighting, every remembered observation, and every passing detail suddenly carried possible significance. The hope remained that Lori's would be found alive. Missing person investigations often depend upon those first few hours, and there was still reason to believe that the child might simply be somewhere waiting to be discovered. That hope, however, would not survive the afternoon. At approximately 4 o'clock, only a few hours after the search had begun, a local resident named Orazio Fidone made a discovery near an area known as Mulino Vecchio, located several kilometers from the Stival family home. The location was far removed from the school where Lori's was supposed to have spent the morning. There, in a ravine, Fidone found the body of a young child. Authorities quickly responded to the scene, and the devastating confirmation soon followed. The victim was identified as Lori's Andrea Stival. The search operation ended almost as quickly as it had begun, but the case itself was only beginning. The moment investigators confirmed the identity of the victim, the investigation fundamentally changed. What had begun as an urgent effort to locate a missing child immediately became a homicide. Investigation. Instead of searching for where Lori's might be, investigators now faced the far more difficult task of determining how he had died, who had killed him, and how his body had come to rest near Mulino Vecchio. The questions became more urgent with every passing hour. If Veronica had truly dropped her son off at school, how had he ended up several kilometers away? How had no one seen him? Who had encountered him during the intervening time? These questions demanded answers that only careful forensic examination could provide. The autopsy became one of the earliest sources of objective evidence in the case. Unlike witness statements, memories, or assumptions, forensic findings offered investigators physical facts that could be independently analyzed. Medical examiners concluded that Lori's had died sometime between approximately 8:30 and 10:00 that morning. This estimated time of death immediately established an important point within the developing timeline. If accurate, Lori's had died during the very hours when he was supposedly attending school. The autopsy further determined that the cause of death was strangulation. Investigators believed that plastic cable ties had likely been used as the ligature responsible for ending the child's life. In addition to the fatal injuries, examiners documented other signs of violence on Lori's body. The forensic evidence also indicated that, after his death, the body had been transported and left in the ravine near Mulino Vecchio in an apparent attempt to conceal the crime. These findings dramatically altered investigators' understanding of the case. The possibility that Lori's had disappeared sometime after attending school no longer matched the medical evidence. Instead, the forensic timeline suggested that he had already been dead during much of the morning. The autopsy, therefore, became the first major indication that the original narrative surrounding his disappearance might not be accurate, although investigators still needed to verify every detail independently. The physical evidence had introduced a profound inconsistency. Veronica had reported dropping her son off at school, yet the forensic examination suggested he had died during the same period when he should have been inside his classroom. This contradiction did not immediately identify a suspect, but it fundamentally changed the direction of the investigation. Detectives now understood that establishing Lori's actual movements that morning would be essential. Every minute between the family's departure from home and the estimated time of death required careful reconstruction. The search for witnesses expanded. While investigators began examining every available source of objective information capable of confirming or disproving the family's account. At this stage, however, no definitive conclusion had yet been reached. The investigation remained focused on gathering facts rather than assigning blame. Veronica continued to maintain that she had taken her son to school. From her perspective, someone else must have encountered him afterward. Yet as investigators compared her statements with the emerging physical evidence, they recognized that significant questions remained unanswered. If Lori's had never entered the school, then where had he actually been during those critical morning hours? If he had died between 8:30 and 10 o'clock, who had been with him? How had his body been transported several kilometers away and left near Mulino Vecchio? The discovery of the body transformed the emotional landscape of the case. What had begun with hope ended in grief before sunset. For Lori's family, the possibility of reunion disappeared forever. For the residents of Santa Croce Camarina, the realization that such violence had occurred within their community was deeply unsettling. For investigators, the challenge had shifted from locating a missing child to reconstructing a crime whose timeline no longer aligned with the account they had first been given. The answers, they suspected, would not come from assumptions or appearances. They would emerge from evidence, surveillance footage, forensic analysis, school records, travel times, and every verifiable detail capable of revealing what truly happened during the short journey that should have ended at the entrance of a school, but instead ended in one of Italy's most disturbing child homicide cases. By the close of November 29th, investigators knew only a handful of indisputable facts. Lori's Andrea Stivel had never attended school that morning. He had died by strangulation sometime between approximately 8:30 and 10:00 a.m. His body had been transported after death and abandoned near Mulino Vecchio. The timeline described by his mother no longer appeared consistent with the physical evidence. Those facts would become the foundation of the investigation that followed. An investigation in which every statement would be tested against objective evidence. Every movement would be reconstructed minute by minute, and every contradiction would gradually lead detectives toward a conclusion few could have imagined when the missing person report was first filed only hours earlier. The discovery of Lori's Andrea Stivel's body marked the end of the search, but it also marked the true beginning of the investigation. Detectives were no longer trying to determine where the 8-year-old had gone. Instead, they faced a much more difficult task: reconstructing the final hours of his life with complete accuracy. Every criminal investigation depends on separating statements from verifiable facts. And in this case, investigators immediately recognized that establishing an exact timeline would be essential. The earliest version of events came from Veronica Panarello herself. She maintained that she had driven Lori's to school on the morning of November 29th, left him outside the building, and continued with her own errands before later discovering that he had never attended class. Initially, this explanation formed the framework of the investigation. But as detectives began comparing her account with objective evidence, that framework slowly began to collapse. rather than accepting any statement at face value. Investigators turned to sources that could neither forget nor reinterpret what had happened. Their first priority became verifying the route Veronica claimed to have taken. One of the most important tools available was surveillance footage. Cameras positioned along roads and traffic routes offered investigators an independent record of vehicle movements throughout the morning. Unlike witness recollections, surveillance footage captured events without emotion or assumption. Investigators carefully reviewed recordings from the roads surrounding Santa Croce Camarena, comparing Veronica's stated movements with what the cameras actually documented. The results proved to be one of the earliest and most significant turning points in the case. According to Veronica, she had driven directly to Lori's school before leaving him there. However, the surveillance footage did not support that account. Instead, investigators found that her vehicle did not follow the route she had described. Even more significantly, the recordings showed her car near the area where Lori's body would later be discovered. This discrepancy immediately transformed the investigation. It was no longer a matter of minor inconsistencies or imperfect memory. The objective record created by the surveillance cameras directly contradicted the central claim that Veronica had left her son safely at school. For investigators, this represented far more than a suspicious detail. It challenged the very foundation of the original timeline. If Veronica had not traveled to the school as she claimed, then the question became unavoidable. Where had Lori's actually been that morning? Surveillance footage alone, however, could not establish every fact. Detectives therefore continued verifying each element of Veronica's account through independent sources. The next critical step involved the school itself. Investigators interviewed teachers and examined attendance records in order to determine whether anyone had seen Lori's that morning. Their findings were remarkably consistent. Teachers confirmed that Lori's never entered the school building. His name was never recorded during attendance. No member of the school staff recalled seeing him arrive. No classmate or teacher placed him inside the school at any point during the morning. This confirmation carried enormous investigative weight because it came from multiple independent witnesses whose accounts aligned with one another. It also eliminated one of the most important assumptions underlying Veronica's version of events. If Lori's had never entered school, then the events leading to his death must have occurred before he could have reached the classroom. Combined with the autopsy, which estimated that he died between approximately 8:30 and 10:00 a.m., the school records further narrowed the possible timeline. Investigators were now working with two objective findings that reinforced each other. Medical evidence established that Lori's died during the morning hours, while school personnel confirmed that he had never attended class. Together, these facts significantly weakened the original explanation provided by Veronica. As detectives continued reconstructing the morning, another seemingly ordinary detail attracted their attention: plastic cable ties. Veronica had told investigators that Lori's had asked to bring several cable ties because they were supposedly needed for a school activity. At first glance, the explanation appeared plausible. Children often carry materials for classroom projects, and such requests are generally unremarkable. However, investigators recognized that every detail connected to the final morning deserved verification. Rather than accepting the explanation, they contacted Lori's teachers to determine whether students had indeed been assigned work involving plastic cable ties. The response was unequivocal. Teachers stated that no such classroom activity had been planned. There had been no assignment requiring cable ties, nor had students been instructed to bring them to school. This discovery did not, by itself, prove guilt. Nevertheless, it introduced another contradiction into Veronica's account. The explanation she had offered for why Lori's supposedly possessed cable ties that morning could not be confirmed by the school. At the same time, forensic examiners had already concluded that plastic cable ties were likely used to strangle the child. Investigators therefore regarded this inconsistency as another important element requiring careful consideration. Each verified contradiction gradually altered the direction of the investigation. Detectives no longer viewed the case primarily through the lens of an unknown offender intercepting a child outside school. Instead, they focused increasingly on reconstructing the period before Lori's could have reached the school grounds at all. This process required more than surveillance footage and school interviews. Investigators also examined phone records, travel times, and the broader sequence of Veronica's movements throughout the morning. Every available piece of information was placed within a detailed timeline. The objective was not merely to identify inconsistencies, but to determine whether the known evidence could support any explanation other than the one emerging from the investigation itself. As the timeline became increasingly precise, detectives concluded that only Veronica had both the opportunity and sufficient time to commit the crime and dispose of Lori's body before reporting him missing later that afternoon. This conclusion was not based upon a single piece of evidence, but rather upon the convergence of multiple independent findings. Surveillance footage contradicted her stated route. School records established that Lori's never arrived. The autopsy placed his death during the morning. Phone data and travel times fit within the reconstructed sequence. Together, these elements formed a coherent investigative picture that differed dramatically from Veronica's original account. On December 9, 2014, only 10 days after Lori's death, Veronica Panarello was arrested. Prosecutors charged her with murder and concealing her son's body. Despite the growing body of evidence, Veronica continued to deny responsibility. She insisted that she had taken Lori's to school and maintained that someone else must have killed him. Her arrest did not end the investigation. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new phase in which investigators attempted to understand not only what had happened, but also why her account continued to diverge from the objective evidence. One of the most unusual aspects of the case emerged through Veronica's repeated changes in her explanation of the events. Rather than maintaining a single consistent narrative, her account evolved over time. Initially, she denied any involvement whatsoever. She asserted that she was innocent and suggested that another person had abducted or murdered her son after she left him at school. This first version remained consistent with the missing child scenario originally presented to investigators. However, as evidence accumulated, her position shifted. In a later account, Veronica stated that she could no longer remember precisely what had happened. Rather than offering a detailed, alternative explanation, she claimed uncertainty about the events of that morning. Memory loss, however, did little to resolve the growing contradictions between her earlier statements and the physical evidence. Investigators continued relying upon independently verified facts rather than changing personal recollections. Eventually, Veronica introduced a third explanation. She claimed that Lori's had died accidentally while playing with plastic cable ties inside the home. According to this version, she panicked after the accidental death and disposed of his body instead of contacting emergency services. For investigators, this represented a significant departure from her original statement that she had dropped him off at school. Yet this explanation also failed to withstand forensic scrutiny. Medical experts concluded that Lori's injuries were inconsistent with an accidental death involving play. The autopsy findings indicated deliberate ligature strangulation rather than an unintended mishap. Consequently, investigators rejected this explanation as incompatible with the physical evidence. Even after multiple contradictory accounts, the investigation took another unexpected turn in early 2016. Veronica advanced an entirely new allegation, one that shifted suspicion toward her father-in-law. Andrea Stivel, She claimed that she and Andrea had maintained a secret romantic relationship and further alleged that Andrea had killed Lori's because the child had discovered the affair. Such an accusation carried serious implications and required formal investigation. Prosecutors therefore examined the allegation despite the absence of supporting evidence. As investigators reviewed Veronica's claims, they searched for physical evidence, witness testimony, or any independent information capable of corroborating the story. None was found. There were no material traces linking Andrea to the homicide, no witnesses supporting Veronica's allegations, and no objective evidence confirming either the alleged relationship or the accusation of murder. Investigators concluded that the claim lacked factual support. Andrea Stivel was ultimately cleared of involvement in the killing. Veronica herself was later convicted of slander for falsely accusing her father-in-law. This episode further illustrated the difficulties investigators encountered throughout the case. Each time Veronica's account changed, detectives were required to examine the new claims thoroughly before determining whether any factual basis existed. Rather than relying upon assumptions, they followed the same investigative principle from beginning to end. Every allegation had to be tested against independently verifiable evidence. In each instance, the objective findings remained consistent while Veronica's explanations changed repeatedly. By the conclusion of the investigation, detectives had assembled a timeline built upon forensic science, surveillance footage, school records, phone data, travel times, and witness testimony. None of these elements alone told the complete story. Together, however, they formed a coherent sequence that prosecutors believed demonstrated Veronica Panarello's responsibility for the murder of her 8-year-old son and the subsequent concealment of his body. Yet despite reconstructing the events with considerable precision, one question continued to resist a definitive answer. Investigators had established who they believed committed the crime, how the original account had unraveled, and why alternative explanations failed to match the evidence. What they could not establish with complete certainty was motive. The exact reason why Lori's lost his life on that November morning remained unresolved, a mystery that would continue to shadow the case even as it moved into the courtroom, where judges would be asked to weigh the evidence, evaluate the contradictions, and ultimately determine Veronica Panarello's criminal responsibility. By the time the case against Veronica Panarello reached the courtroom, investigators had already spent months reconstructing the events of November 29, 2014. The frantic search for a missing child had evolved into one of the most closely followed criminal proceedings in modern Italy. Public attention remained intense, not only because the victim was an 8-year-old boy, but also because of the extraordinary path the investigation had taken. What initially appeared to be a tragic disappearance had become a homicide case built upon forensic science, surveillance footage, witness testimony, and a timeline that prosecutors argued could no longer support Veronica's original account. Yet despite the growing body of evidence, one important question remained unresolved even as the trial began. Although investigators believed they had established who was responsible for Lori's Andrea Stivel's death, they still could not explain with certainty why it had happened. The courtroom would therefore become the place where evidence was measured against law, where every contradiction would be examined, and where judges would ultimately decide whether the prosecution had proven Veronica's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The proceedings focused not on speculation or public emotion, but on the objective findings gathered. During the investigation, prosecutors presented a case built from multiple independent sources of evidence rather than a single decisive piece. They relied upon surveillance recordings that contradicted Veronica's description of her route that morning. They pointed to school records confirming that Lori's never entered the classroom despite Veronica's claim that she had dropped him off outside the school. They referred to the forensic examination establishing that the child died between approximately 8:30 and 10 0 a.m., a period during which he should have been attending school according to Veronica's original version of events. They also emphasized the inconsistencies surrounding the plastic cable ties. Veronica had stated that Lori's wanted to bring them for a school activity, yet teachers confirmed that no such assignment existed. Prosecutors argued that when these pieces of evidence were viewed together rather than individually, they formed a consistent narrative that contradicted Veronica's repeated claims of innocence. The defense, meanwhile, faced the difficult challenge of addressing not only the physical evidence, but also Veronica's own changing explanations. Throughout the investigation, she had offered multiple versions of what had happened. Initially, she insisted that she had taken Lori's to school and that someone else must have abducted or murdered him. Later, she claimed she could not accurately remember the events of that morning. Eventually, she introduced the explanation that Lori's had accidentally died while playing with plastic cable ties inside the home, and that she had panicked before disposing of his body. Forensic experts, however, had already rejected this version because the injuries documented during the autopsy were incompatible with an accidental death. The repeated changes in Veronica's account became an important aspect of the prosecution's argument. Prosecutors maintained that while objective evidence had remained consistent throughout the investigation, Veronica's explanations had shifted repeatedly as new evidence emerged. The court therefore had to evaluate not only what Veronica said, but also whether her statements could be reconciled with independently verified facts. The legal proceedings also considered Veronica's later accusation against her father-in-law, Andrea Stivel. During the investigation, she alleged that she had maintained a secret romantic relationship with him and claimed that Andrea had murdered Lori's after the child supposedly discovered the affair. Because such an allegation was serious, investigators had thoroughly examined it before the trial. However, prosecutors informed the court that no physical evidence, no witness testimony, and no independent information supported Veronica's accusation. Andrea Stivel had been cleared of any involvement after investigators found nothing capable of corroborating her claims. This episode further illustrated the broader pattern that had characterized the investigation from the beginning. Veronica's explanations changed repeatedly, yet the objective evidence consistently failed to support those changes. Throughout the proceedings, the judges were required to distinguish between established facts and unanswered questions. One of the most significant unresolved issues concerned motive. Criminal trials often seek to explain not only how a crime occurred, but also why it happened. In the case of Lori Stivel, however, the exact motive was never conclusively established. The prosecution did not present evidence demonstrating that the homicide had been carefully planned over an extended period, nor did investigators identify a long-standing conflict that clearly explained the killing. Instead, the court considered the possibility that Veronica acted during a sudden burst of anger. According to the court's assessment, the incident may have been connected to Lori's refusing to go to school, or some conflict that developed during the morning. Nevertheless, this conclusion remained an interpretation of the available evidence rather than a definitively proven motive. Importantly, the court acknowledged that no evidence established the crime as the result of long-term premeditation. This distinction reflected the limits of the investigation itself. While forensic science and surveillance technology could reconstruct many physical events, they could not fully reveal the thoughts or emotions that preceded them. The absence of a definitive motive did not prevent the court from evaluating the strength of the physical evidence. Criminal responsibility can be established through objective proof even when the precise psychological motivation remains uncertain. After considering the evidence presented by both sides, the court reached its decision. On October 17, 2016, Veronica Panerillo was found guilty of murdering her 8-year-old son, Lori's Andrea Stivel, and concealing his body. She was sentenced to 30 years imprisonment under Italy's fast-track judicial procedure. In delivering its judgment, the court concluded that Veronica was fully criminally responsible for her actions. The evidence presented during the investigation and examined throughout the trial convinced the judges that the prosecution had established her guilt. The verdict represented the culmination of nearly 2 years of investigation, forensic analysis, and legal proceedings. Yet the judicial process did not end with the initial conviction. Veronica challenged the judgment through the available appeals process, seeking to overturn the decision. Higher courts subsequently reviewed both the evidence and the legal reasoning underlying the original verdict. After those reviews, the conviction and the 30-year prison sentence were upheld. The judgment therefore became final, bringing the criminal proceedings to their legal conclusion. Although the appeals confirmed the trial court's findings, they did not resolve every question surrounding the case. Even after the verdict became final, observers continued to note that one aspect of the tragedy remained elusive. The courts had determined who was legally responsible for Lori's death, and the evidence had established the sequence of events sufficiently to support a conviction. What remained uncertain was the exact motive that transformed an ordinary school morning into a fatal act of violence. Unlike some criminal cases in which financial gain, revenge, or long-term planning provide clear explanations, the murder of Lori Stivel left behind an unanswered psychological question. The law had delivered its judgment, but the deeper reason behind the crime remained unknown. For the justice system, however, the absence of a complete motive did not diminish the weight of the objective evidence. The surveillance recordings, forensic findings, school records, travel timeline, and Veronica's own contradictory statements collectively established the factual basis upon which the verdict rested. The courtroom had fulfilled its role by determining criminal responsibility according to the evidence available. Yet beyond the legal judgment stood a far greater tragedy that no sentence could reverse. An 8-year-old child who had left home expecting an ordinary school day would never return. The legal process had reached its conclusion, but for Lori's family, for the community of Santa Croce Camarina, and for everyone who had followed the case, the consequences of that November morning would continue long after the courtroom fell silent. The final chapter of the story would therefore be measured not in legal arguments or judicial decisions, but in the lasting impact left by a crime that forever changed the lives of those connected to Lori's and became one of the most haunting child homicide cases in contemporary Italian history. The conviction of Veronica Panarello brought a legal conclusion to the case of Lori's Andrea Stivel, but it could never undo the events of November 29, 2014. A court could determine responsibility. A sentence could be imposed. Evidence could be reviewed, and judgments could be confirmed. But none of these processes could restore the life of an 8-year-old child whose future had ended on a morning that was supposed to be completely ordinary. After the verdict became final, the story of Lori's did not disappear. Instead, the case remained deeply remembered in Italy because it represented not only a criminal investigation, but also a profound human tragedy. At its center was a child who should have been preparing for another day of school, a family that was permanently changed, and a community that was forced to confront a crime that seemed impossible to understand. Following her conviction, Veronica Panarello began serving her sentence in prison. According to publicly available information, she was held in a prison facility in Turin, where she later participated in educational activities and training aimed at becoming a healthcare support worker. Her life continued within the restrictions of imprisonment, separated from the freedom and family life she had known before the tragedy. The legal consequences of her conviction extended beyond the sentence itself. The family structure that had existed before November 2014 was permanently altered. The younger child of Veronica and Davide Stivel was placed under the care of his father, Davide. The family relationships that once connected the Stivel and Panarello households were also deeply affected. Members of Davide's family stated publicly that they no longer maintained contact with Veronica. After the conviction, these changes reflected the broader impact of the crime. A homicide does not affect only the victim and the person convicted. It creates a lasting rupture that extends through families and communities, leaving consequences that continue long after the courtroom proceedings have ended. For Davide Stivel, the loss was both personal and irreversible. He lost his son and faced the reality that the person convicted of causing that loss was the child's own mother. The case, therefore, carried an additional emotional weight because it involved the destruction of a family bond that society often considers one of the strongest forms of protection: the relationship between parent and child. The tragedy surrounding Lori's became one of the reasons the case received such intense attention. Throughout Italy, the circumstances were deeply disturbing, not only because a child had been murdered, but because the initial appearance of the case was so different from its eventual conclusion. At the beginning, Veronica was viewed as a mother searching for her missing son. She reported his disappearance and participated in the early stages of the search. Like many members of the public, investigators initially approached the situation as a missing child case. The transformation from that first impression into a homicide investigation involving the child's own mother became one of the most shocking aspects of the story. Another reason the case remained widely discussed was the role of objective evidence in challenging the original narrative. The investigation demonstrated how modern criminal inquiries rely on the careful combination of multiple sources of information. Surveillance cameras provided a record of movements that could be compared against statements. School records established whether Lori's had actually entered the building. Forensic examination determined the approximate time and cause of death. Phone records and travel analysis helped investigators reconstruct the sequence of events. No single element alone explained the entire case, but together they formed a pattern that prosecutors argued proved Veronica's responsibility. The investigation also highlighted the importance of consistency in criminal cases. Throughout the proceedings, one of the most significant issues was the repeated change in Veronica's explanations. Her first account described a disappearance after a school drop-off. Later explanations introduced uncertainty and eventually a claim of accidental death. Finally, she accused Andrea Stivel, her father-in-law, of being responsible. Each new version required investigators to examine whether it was supported by evidence. Ultimately, they concluded that none of these alternative explanations matched the verified facts established during the investigation. The accusation against Andrea Stivel became another major chapter in the case. But investigators found no physical evidence, no witnesses, and no independent information connecting him to Lori's murder. After reviewing the available information, authorities determined that he was not involved. Veronica was later convicted for slandering him by making false accusations. This part of the case demonstrated the difficult responsibility faced by investigators. Every allegation, even one made by someone already under suspicion, must be examined carefully. The search for truth requires investigating claims rather than simply accepting or rejecting them based on emotion. However, while the investigation and trial established criminal responsibility, one question remained unanswered. Why did it happen? The exact motive behind Lori's death was never fully clarified. This uncertainty became one of the most haunting aspects of the case. Investigators and the court examined the possibility that Veronica acted during a sudden moment of anger, potentially connected to a conflict that occurred that morning, including the possibility that Lori's did not want to go to school. However, no evidence demonstrated a carefully planned crime or provided a complete explanation of the psychological factors behind the act. This distinction is important. A criminal investigation can determine what happened, who was responsible, and how events unfolded. Yet still be unable to fully explain the thoughts and emotions that led to the crime. In the case of Lori Stivell, the evidence answered many questions, but not all of them. The verdict established the legal truth recognized by the courts. It identified Veronica Panarello as responsible for her son's death and confirmed the sentence imposed against her. But the emotional questions remained with those left behind. How could a child lose his life in such circumstances? What moment transformed an ordinary morning into a tragedy? What thoughts existed in the minutes before Lori's death? These questions remained part of the unresolved human dimension of the case. Beyond the investigation, the trial, and the media attention, the most important fact remains the loss of Lori's himself. He was 8 years old. He was not a headline, not a piece of evidence, and not merely the subject of a criminal case. He was a child whose life ended before he had the opportunity to grow older, experience the future, and create memories beyond the small circle of family and community that knew him. True crime investigations often focus naturally on the actions of the offender, the evidence collected, and a legal process that follows. However, the story of Lori Stivell requires remembering the victim at the center of the case. The purpose of examining the investigation is not to give greater importance to the crime than to the person whose life was taken. Instead, it is to understand how evidence, persistence, and careful investigation can reveal the truth after an unimaginable loss. The case also serves as an example of how first impressions can be misleading. At the beginning, the situation appeared simple. A child had disappeared after being taken to school. But as investigators followed the evidence, the original assumption was replaced by a very different reality. The case showed that in criminal investigations, appearances are only the beginning. Truth must be established through facts that can withstand examination. Years after the events of November 29, 2014, the name Lori Stivell remains associated with one of Italy's most widely remembered child homicide cases. The legal process ended with a conviction, but the tragedy itself continues to represent something much larger than a courtroom decision. It remains a reminder of the vulnerability of children, the devastating consequences of violence, and the importance of seeking truth through evidence rather than assumption. The final image of this case is not the courtroom, the investigation files, or the media coverage. It is the unanswered silence left behind by the loss of an 8-year-old boy who was expected to return home after school, but never did. A simple morning routine became a national tragedy. A child's absence became a search for answers. And although the courts ultimately delivered their judgment, the memory of Lori's Andrea Stivell remains the most important part of the story, a child whose life was far more significant than the crime that ended it. The story of Lori's Andrea Stivell reached its legal conclusion with a conviction. But the end of a trial does not always mean the end of a tragedy. Some cases remain in public memory, not because they lack answers, but because the answers that exist still leave behind profound questions about human behavior, family, and the circumstances that allow an irreversible act to occur. The case of Lori Stivell is one of those cases. It began with a simple report of a missing child and ended with one of Italy's most discussed criminal judgments. Yet beyond the investigation files, the courtroom arguments, and the years of legal proceedings, there remains the central reality that an 8-year-old boy lost his life. Everything else, the evidence, the accusations, the verdicts, and the debates exist because of that one devastating fact. When investigators first received the report that Lori's was missing, the situation appeared to be a search for a child who had disappeared. The first hours were shaped by urgency and hope. Authorities, residents, and the community searched for a positive outcome. Like any missing child investigation, the priority was to find Lori's and bring him home safely. Instead, the discovery near Mulino Vecchio transformed the entire nature of the case. The search for a missing child became an investigation into a violent death. From that moment forward, every detail of the final morning became significant. The route that should have led Lori's to school became the focus of a reconstruction. The timeline between leaving home and the discovery of his body became the center of a complex. Examination. Investigators were forced to look beyond the first explanation they received and compare every statement against objective evidence. This process revealed the importance of facts that cannot change according to memory or emotion. Surveillance footage provided information about movements. School records established whether Lori's had entered the building. Forensic findings revealed the approximate time and cause of death. These elements created a timeline that prosecutors argued demonstrated Veronica Panarello's responsibility. The case also showed the difficulty of understanding motive in criminal investigations. Often, people searching for explanations expect a clear answer, a reason that can be identified, examined, and understood. However, in the case of Lori Stivel, the exact motive was never fully established. The courts determined responsibility, but they could not completely explain the thoughts or emotions that led to the crime. The possibility considered by the court was that Veronica acted during a sudden moment of anger, possibly connected to a conflict that occurred that morning. However, the deeper psychological reasons behind such an act remained uncertain. This uncertainty is one of the most disturbing aspects of the case because it leaves a gap between knowing what happened and understanding why it happened. The investigation also demonstrated how difficult it can be to uncover the truth when statements repeatedly change. Veronica Panarello first maintained that she had taken Lori's to school and that someone else was responsible for his disappearance. Later, she presented different explanations, including the claim that he had died accidentally and that she had hidden his body out of panic. She eventually accused Andrea Stivel, her father-in-law, of being involved. Each version required examination, and each was compared with the evidence available. Investigators concluded that the alternative explanations were not supported by facts. Andrea Stivel was cleared because no physical evidence, witnesses, or independent information connected him to the murder. Veronica was later convicted for making false accusations against him. The changing narratives became one of the defining features of the case. But they also highlighted an essential principle of criminal investigation. Evidence must remain the foundation of the search for truth. The tragedy of Lori Stivel also reminds us that behind every criminal case, there is a victim whose identity should never be reduced to the circumstances of their death. Public attention often focuses naturally on the person accused, the investigation, and the legal outcome. However, the most important part of this story is the child whose life was taken. Lori's was 8 years old. He was a son, a child within a family, and a member of a community. His future ended before it had the chance to unfold. No verdict, no sentence, and no explanation can change that loss. For the people closest to him, the consequences of that day continued long after the cameras disappeared and the courtroom proceedings ended. The family structure that existed before November 29, 2014, could never be restored. Davide Stivel continued living with the loss of his son, while the relationships between family members were permanently altered. The younger child remained under Davide's care, and the separation between Veronica and the family represented another consequence of the tragedy. The legal system had reached its decision, but the emotional consequences remained ongoing. The case of Lori Stivel also illustrates the role of modern investigative methods in uncovering the truth. Without surveillance footage, forensic analysis, school records, and detailed timeline reconstruction, the investigation might have followed a very different path. Each piece of evidence contributed to a larger picture. No single discovery solved the case alone, but together they allowed investigators and courts to evaluate the competing explanations and determine which version was consistent with reality. In this way, the case became an example of how criminal investigations depend not only on finding suspects, but on carefully testing every claim against facts. The passage of time has not erased the significance of the case. The name Laurie Stivell remains remembered because the circumstances surrounding his death touched on some of the deepest fears within society. The vulnerability of children, the possibility of violence within a family, and the difficulty of understanding actions that seem impossible to comprehend. But remembering this case should not mean remembering only the crime. It should also mean remembering the child at the center of it. The final image of Laurie's story is not simply the investigation, the arrest, or the conviction. It is the unanswered absence left behind by a child who should have returned home after school. It is the silence that replaced an ordinary family routine. It is the reminder that every case file represents a human life that existed before tragedy changed. Everything. The justice system provided an answer to the question of responsibility. The evidence provided a reconstruction of events. The courts delivered sentence. But the loss itself remains beyond the reach of any legal decision. Laurie's Andrea Stivell was 8 years old when his life ended. And that fact remains the most important truth in this entire story. The investigation may be remembered for its contradictions, its evidence, and its courtroom battles. But the memory of Laurie's should remain centered on the child whose life was taken and whose story became a reminder of the importance of truth, justice, and compassion. The case of Laurie's Andrea Stivell remains one of the most painful and widely remembered criminal cases in Italy because it combined several elements that deeply affected public perception. The loss of a young child, the involvement of a parent, the collapse of an initial explanation, and a search for answers that continued long after the courtroom delivered its verdict. Yet when the details of the investigation, the trial, and the aftermath are examined, the story ultimately returns to one central fact: a child's life was taken. And the consequences of that loss extended far beyond the events of a single morning in Santa Croce Camarina. On November 29, 2014, Laurie's left home as part of a routine that should have been completely ordinary. Like countless children across the world, he was expected to attend school, spend the day learning, and return home afterward. Instead, that routine became the beginning of a tragedy that would change the lives of everyone connected to him. The investigation that followed attempted to reconstruct not only where Laurie's had gone, but also how an ordinary morning had become a crime scene. In doing so, investigators revealed the importance of examining every detail, no matter how small it may initially appear. The case demonstrated that truth in a criminal investigation is rarely discovered through one dramatic moment. Instead, it often emerges through the accumulation of many individual facts that, when placed together, reveal a larger picture. In the case of Laurie Stivell, that picture was built from surveillance footage, forensic findings, school records, witness statements, phone data, and the reconstruction of movements throughout the morning. Each piece of evidence played a role in challenging the original account and establishing the timeline accepted by the courts. The investigation began with uncertainty. A mother reported that her child had disappeared after being taken to school. At first, the focus was on locating a missing boy. The possibility that he could still be found alive shaped the first response. But as the evidence developed, investigators were forced to confront a far more disturbing reality. Laurie's had never entered the school. He had died during the morning hours. His body had been moved and abandoned near Mulino Vecchio. The explanation initially provided did not correspond with the facts established through investigation. This transformation, from missing child case to homicide investigation, was one of the defining characteristics of the case. It also demonstrated the difficult responsibility faced by investigators. They had to follow evidence, even when doing so meant moving away from the assumptions formed at the beginning. The eventual conviction of Veronica Panarello was based not on public opinion or emotional reactions, but on the collection and evaluation of evidence. The courts concluded that she was responsible for the murder of her son and for concealing his body. Her sentence of 30 years in prison represented the legal consequence of that judgment. The appeals process later confirmed the conviction, bringing the judicial proceedings to their conclusion. However, even after the final verdict, the case continued to generate discussion because some questions remained unanswered. Among the most significant was the question of motive. The courts determined responsibility, but the exact reason behind the crime was never completely established. This uncertainty is common in many criminal cases, where investigators can reconstruct actions more clearly than they can understand the internal thoughts of the person responsible. Evidence can show what happened. It can show when events occurred and who was involved. But understanding why a person made a particular decision can be much more difficult. In the case of Lori's, the absence of a fully confirmed motive remained one of the most troubling aspects of the tragedy. The court considered the possibility that Veronica acted during a sudden moment of anger connected to a conflict that morning, possibly involving Lori's reluctance to attend school. However, there was no evidence that the crime had been carefully planned over an extended period. The distinction between what was proven and what remained uncertain was an important part of the judicial process. While the evidence established criminal responsibility, it did not provide a complete explanation of the emotional circumstances that led to the event. Another lasting element of the case was the series of changing explanations provided by Veronica throughout the investigation. Her first claim was that she had taken Lori's to school and that another person must have been responsible. Later, she suggested she could not fully remember what had happened. Eventually, she presented the theory that Lori's had died accidentally and that she had hidden his body in panic. Later still, she accused Andrea Stivel, her father-in-law, of involvement. Investigators examined each version carefully. They did not dismiss allegations simply because they came from a person under suspicion. Instead, they investigated whether those claims were supported by evidence. Ultimately, they found no physical evidence, witnesses, or independent information connecting Andrea Stivel to the crime. He was cleared of involvement, and Veronica was later convicted for making false accusations against him. This part of the case became a reminder of the importance of separating claims from proof. A statement, no matter how serious, must be tested against facts before it can be accepted as truth. For the community of Santa Croce Camarina, the case left a lasting mark. A place associated with ordinary daily life became internationally recognized because of a tragedy that occurred within its streets. The residents who participated in the search for Lori's experienced the painful transition from hope to grief. What began as a collective effort to find a missing child ended with the realization that the outcome could not be changed. Communities often struggle to process crimes that violate fundamental expectations about safety and family. The case of Lori Stivel was especially disturbing because it involved the loss of a child and because the investigation eventually centered on the child's own mother. It challenged assumptions about where danger can come from and reminded people that appearances alone cannot reveal the truth. However, while the circumstances surrounding his death were shocking, Lori's should not be remembered only through the tragedy that ended his life. His story should also be understood as a reminder of the responsibility to protect children and to recognize their value beyond any criminal narrative. The purpose of remembering such cases is not to preserve the details of violence, but to acknowledge the human life that was lost. Years after the investigation concluded, The name Laurie Stivel continues to represent a case that transformed a small Sicilian community and captured national attention. The legal questions were answered. The evidence was examined. The courts reached their decision. But the emotional impact of the case remains because some losses cannot be measured by legal outcomes alone. A sentence can punish the person responsible, but it cannot return a child to his family. A verdict can establish accountability, but it cannot erase the pain experienced by those who loved him. The final lesson of the Laurie Stivel case is therefore not only about crime or investigation. It is about the importance of truth, the need for careful examination of evidence, and the recognition that behind every case file is a person whose life mattered. Laurie's was 8 years old when he died. He was a child with a family, a place in his community, and a future that should have continued. The investigation that followed may be remembered for its contradictions, its discoveries, and its courtroom battles. But the most meaningful way to remember the case is to keep the focus where it belongs, on the young boy whose life was taken and whose absence changed everyone who knew his name. The story of Laurie Stivel is ultimately a story of loss, unanswered questions, and the search for truth after unimaginable tragedy. It is a reminder that justice is necessary, but memory and compassion are equally important. Long after the legal proceedings ended, the silence left by the loss of an 8-year-old child remains the most powerful part of the story. Every criminal case eventually reaches a point where the evidence has been examined. The arguments have been presented, and the courts have delivered their judgment. The legal process creates a conclusion that allows society to recognize responsibility and move forward. But some cases remain in public consciousness because the emotional questions they leave behind are far more difficult to resolve. The murder of Laurie's Andrea Stivel is one of those cases. It is remembered not only because of the investigation that followed or the conviction that was reached, but because at the center of everything was an 8-year-old child whose life ended before anyone could understand the full extent of what was lost. The story of Laurie's is ultimately a reminder that behind every investigation there is a human life that existed before the crime, before the headlines, before the courtroom, before the evidence. There was a child living an ordinary life with his family in Santa Croce Camarina. His name became known throughout Italy because of tragedy. But the importance of his story lies not only in the circumstances of his death. It lies in recognizing that he was a person whose life had value beyond the events that followed. The investigation into his death became one of the most detailed and closely followed cases in Italy. During the 2010s, it involved the careful examination of timelines, physical evidence, and statements that changed over time. But the reason the case affected so many people was not simply the complexity of the investigation. It was the painful contrast between the ordinary nature of the beginning and the devastating reality of the outcome. A school morning became a homicide investigation. A routine journey became a reconstruction of a final timeline. A family home became connected forever with a tragedy that could not be reversed. The case also demonstrated how difficult it can be for society to understand crimes that occur within families. Many people naturally view the family as the place where children should receive their greatest protection and security. When violence occurs within that environment, it challenges deeply held assumptions about trust, responsibility, and human behavior. The case of Laurie Stivel was particularly shocking because the investigation eventually concluded that the person responsible was someone who was expected to protect him. This reality contributed to the intense public attention surrounding the case and made it one of the most discussed criminal proceedings in Italy. Yet even in cases that attract widespread attention, there is always a risk that the victim becomes overshadowed by the person accused and the details of the investigation. The more a case is discussed through evidence, theories, and courtroom arguments, the easier it can become to forget the individual whose life was taken. For that reason, remembering Lori's requires looking beyond the crime itself. He was not simply a name in a judicial file or a subject of public debate. He was an 8-year-old child whose future disappeared on a day that should have been completely normal. The investigation demonstrated the importance of patience and accuracy in the search for truth. At the beginning, investigators were faced with a story that appeared simple. A child had been taken to school and had vanished afterward. But as they examined the available information, they discovered contradictions that could not be ignored. The surveillance footage did not match the reported route. The school confirmed that Lori's had never entered the building. The forensic examination established a timeline that contradicted the original account. The explanation involving plastic cable ties did not correspond with the information provided by teachers. Each fact added another piece to the reconstruction of events. This process showed that justice depends on the ability to question assumptions. A statement may appear convincing. A situation may seem straightforward. But evidence must always determine the direction of an investigation. The case of Lori Stivel became an example of how investigators must remain committed to facts even when the truth is difficult to accept. At the same time, the investigation also revealed the limitations of what evidence can accomplish. Investigators and courts were able to determine responsibility. They were able to establish what happened and who was held accountable. But they could not provide a complete answer to the deepest question that often remains after a tragedy. Why? The absence of a fully confirmed motive left a lasting sense of uncertainty. The court considered possible explanations, including the possibility of a sudden act of anger during a conflict that morning. But the exact emotional and psychological circumstances behind the crime remained unclear. This distinction between knowing what happened and understanding why it happened is one of the most difficult aspects of criminal cases. Human behavior is sometimes more complicated than the evidence left behind. The aftermath of the case continued to affect the people closest to Lori's. Davide Stivel faced the unimaginable loss of his son and the collapse of the family life that had existed before the tragedy. The younger child remained in his care, while relationships within the wider family were permanently changed. The consequences extended beyond the courtroom because the damage caused by the crime could not be contained within a legal judgment. A prison sentence could hold the person responsible accountable, but it could not restore what had been taken away. For the wider community, the case became a symbol of grief and reflection. Santa Croce Camarina became associated with a tragedy that attracted national attention. But for the people who lived there, it was not simply a famous criminal case. It was the loss of a child who had been part of their community. The streets, places, and routines that once represented everyday life became connected to a painful memory. Communities often carry the emotional weight of crimes that occur among them, especially when the victim is young and the circumstances are difficult to comprehend. The story of Lori Stivel also raises broader questions about the role of memory in true crime. There is value in understanding investigations, legal decisions, and the methods used to establish truth. However, there's also a responsibility to remember victims with dignity. The purpose of examining a tragedy should not be to focus only on the shocking aspects of the crime, but to understand the human consequences behind it. Every detail of an investigation represents a life that was interrupted and people who were left behind. In Lori's case, the most important memory is not the controversy surrounding the trial or the conflicting explanations that emerged afterward. It is the fact that a child was lost. Years after the events of November 29, 2014, the case remains part of Italy's criminal history. The conviction of Veronica Panarello stands as the legal conclusion recognized by the courts. The evidence collected during the investigation continues to define the official reconstruction of events. But the emotional legacy of the case exists beyond legal documents. It remains in the memory of those who followed the search, the investigation, and the trial. It remains in the questions that were never fully answered. And most importantly, it remains in the memory of Lorries himself. The final reflection of the case is therefore not about the person convicted or the details of the crime. It is about the importance of remembering the victim as a child whose life mattered. The tragedy of Lori Stivell is a reminder that behind every investigation is a person whose future was taken away. And behind every verdict is a family and a community that must continue living with the consequences. Justice provided an answer regarding responsibility. Evidence provided an explanation of events. But memory preserves something even more important: the recognition that Lorries was more than the circumstances of his death. He was an 8-year-old boy whose life deserved to continue, and whose absence remains the deepest and most painful truth of this case.